How about some more, since everybody enjoys it, of our admirable, our objective, our well-founded, our well-placed kick in life's pants. Our sarcastic, quite aggressive but objective and well-deserved kick. Since I'm sure that's what many people that might hear this for the first time is going to think anyway. Because you might as well face it, we've got just as much right to indulge in cheap jokes as any other Presbyterian or ordinary human. So consider, institutions exist to assist man in not thinking. Contrary to what you might think we have either talked about or that you thought about on your own before, there is no doubt that life injects into the human intellect an adequate continuing supply of what would seem to be institutionalized intelligence. In fact, we could get way off the track. Here I go. And I could ask you to consider, which was not part of tonight's joke up until now, but now it is. Haha, I liked it too. Okay. Is where does any of the ordinary intelligence come from? All the way from science to the less apparent tangible extremes of religion, philosophy. Now, there does seem to be individuals in life that stand out, right? Except, did they stand out historically, or are they remembered outside some kind of institutional, moldy growth? I mean, who would remember Fleming had he not ended up and covered in penicillin, the institution of penicillin? Trust me. You would have never heard of him. Institutionalized knowledge can be looked at, or institutionalized thinking. And, of course, from an institutional view, the object of thinking is to produce an object, a subject, knowledge. And that would seem to be, from one view, I was going to leave this with you, you could almost ask yourself, where does, at the ordinary street level, where does any ordinary knowledge come from other than the institutions that life seems to provide? But back to what we were talking about more specifically, believe it or not, the institutionalized knowledge, when it gets down to the personal level that I intended to try and point to by saying that institutions are to assist men in not thinking, is something quite specific. The institutional knowledge that would seem to be of supreme importance, not just scientific or technical information and directives, but the kinds of knowledge that would seem to be the driving forces, the kind of driving directions, and hence to make a man's life satisfying, complete, a pleasure to the universe. What is this institutionalized knowledge? Of what direction in the 3D world, based upon polarized movements of energy, in what way is the institutional thinking that life injects into man's intellect, into his nervous system, in what way could we describe this institutionalized thought? That is, vis-a-vis how to live a better life. Trying to move towards some goal, whatever it was called. In the sense that it is to assist men in not thinking, to answer my rhetorical question, then I would submit to you that if you look, the institutionalized thought, the institutionalized direction, the institutionalized ways of apparently thinking that life has injected in man is specifically into the area of what not to do. Specifically, what not to do. All the way from what should be the obvious, what not to think, what not to feel, what not to actually do in the sense of behavior. What not to think, to be a Christian, don't lust after Jimmy Carter's wife in your heart. What not to eat, to be a Muslim. What not to actually do, to be a humane, charitable person. You are surrounded And I know it appears to be from these structures that I am, in fact, calling again institutions. Except the institutions, recall, are not the buildings of a church somewhere, of a temple, of a charitable institution. The institutions are men. And the institutions of men are what? The talking nervous system. So the institutions, there is nowhere to look at a building, there's nowhere to look at Harvard, there's nowhere to look at a religion and say, well, it's the religion's fault of just saying, well, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. They're not helping us think, if that's what you're saying, but it's their fault. Whose fault? I mean, you can't point at the church. You can't point at Islam. You cannot point at Christianity. You cannot point at some sort of humanistic philosophy, even if they have a building with a real expensive sign that says humanistic philosophy building. Humanistic philosophy building, organization, institution, etc. You still go inside, and there is no such institution unless you've got what in there? Not sandwiches, people. Is there no people in there? Is there no people in the building? You got a building, but you got no institution. Do note, people, many of you have written questions off and on, and so I know, even beyond that many of you have had little thoughts, or you should have by now. Do note, and if you're able to in any way begin to approach above street level thinking, turbocharged real thinking, of course you do not see this as being a fallacy or a shortcoming of someone, of some institution. It is simply this attempt to more and more see how life is arranged. It is that there's almost no specific directions given in life at any level as to specifically what you should do to be a more complete, a more complex, a more satisfying, is that about covered, person. In other words, I tried to give you a whole leeway that quite ordinary people would say, well, the way to live a more complex life or more satisfying life is you have got to serve somebody. And I don't mean working at Burger King. You've got to satisfy something external, like a God. Or I've got to satisfy my religion. I've got to satisfy my local tribe, my neighborhood. We're all Irish Catholic or whatever it is. So it's that kind of feeling that many, many, many people, if they were held down and you threaten to pull out their fingernails or make them talk to a body and fender man all day, they might say, well, you're right. All right, a dentist then, if you're going to take it personally. I don't know whether you people that are laughing the hardest have ever tried to talk to a dentist, whether you are a dentist, or whether you've never tried it and you just don't understand it. I'll only point this out. There's statistical information, evidence. Now, I'm just repeating what I heard, but there's supposedly some statistical evidence to show that insofar as professions that require more than 2 years out of some technical school, that dentists, more shots are taken, random shots at dentists, than any other profession. Other, of course, than body and fender man. But at any rate, so you could, if they were held down, an ordinary person, an ordinary intelligence might say, they might try to describe, not wrong or right, but they might try and describe, whether they intended to initially or not, if you're saying, what would it take to live a better life? They might begin to describe what it would be to be a good Muslim or a Jew, or what it would be to be a good American. It's just easier with religion because they have what? More do nots, more specifically do nots. Because you can be a patriot with almost just one do not, which says do not be treasonous. But to be a good Catholic or a good Jew or something, you got to do more. That is, not do more. So some people could describe it or attempt to describe, well, the way to live a more complete life would be, and then they would describe something that would apparently be to appease outer forces. Then there would be people nowadays, and even in the past, but now you might have more people that would attempt to describe something that would be like trying to please myself in some more complex way, trying to please the adult in me, trying to appease or please the philosopher adult in me. trying to be a more complete human. At any rate, you've got what would appear to be the full spectrum from the apparent out there to the apparent in here. But all of it, note, all of it, not to blame, put the blame, because even if you put it on the level of trying to please yourself, if you tried to, if I was speaking for ordinary intelligence, and you tried to say, how many gestures can you make in life? Well, I don't know. That isn't what I was going to say. My hand made me say that. Even if you said, well, I do not subscribe personally to being driven by those naughty EFs, not Hutton, but external forces. I try to please me. In fact, now I think back, even in institutionalized psychology, somebody came up with the idea that their humanity was divided into two groups of people, dentists and body and fender men. No, those who are externally driven and those who are internally driven. And so you would have people nowadays that would pass for being intelligent, having never subjected themselves to a 2-year community college or technical school. But they would try and refer to themselves as being intelligent, and part of the proof would be, part of their evidence would be, that I am not driven, they're still talking and responding to me, I am not driven by some outdated religious structure, philosophy. I'm not driven by what my neighbors think about me. I am a deep person. I am contemplative, maybe even slightly neurotic, but I meditate. I am more interested in pleasing me. Ah, now we're getting somewhere, right? Yeah, right. Okay. If that were true, which is not, unless in some way they can fall out of the closet. But it's not true, but if it were true, then you've got to ask this. And you've got to be able to answer it and see it right quick yourself. If that were true, that there is some way that in the three-dimensional world, down at street level, that you in some way can actually cut yourself apart, that you can be a tree, you can be an apple some way actually separate from the orchard. You can be a fish some way distant from that very uncomfortable, sometimes unprofitable water. If that were possible, then ask yourself this, though. If that were true, and I'm sure some of your people's nervous system would say that you are more driven by trying to please your internal self, what are the directions? Because yourself, at the old level, is an institution. That is the collection of the neurological kind of patterns that make you appear to be Gunther or Brunhilde. And so that institutional, if you're just trying to please you, what's it on the basis of? I'm going to quit smoking. That'd make me a better person. I'm going to absolutely lose weight. It's all you're doing is replaying thou shalt not, thou shalt not. It is the institutionalized direction and thinking, apparently, what not to do to be a better person. Because you ask somebody, if you stop them on the street with a clipboard, that is, you have a clipboard and you stop them. I don't suggest you try and stop somebody with a clipboard. And you say, I would like to ask you, may I ask you, I'm taking a survey, may I ask you, what would it take, would you call yourself a perfect person? Well, no, certainly not. Would you say that you're as happy as you could be? No, I wouldn't. That's 99 point something of all. And you said, all right, do you know what it would take to make you a better / or happier person? And they'd go, well, I have some good ideas. And you say, all right, that's 3 questions. One more. What would they be? What would you and everybody else normally, ordinarily, routinely be driven to say? You'd start detailing 1 or 2 things that you should not be doing. Think about it a second. There is almost no specific directions apparently out there, or if you were that crude to still think that in some way you could just suddenly conjure up your own directions, your own ideas. Even if you could, look in both places, there is almost no specific thinking done, directions given regarding what a person should do. The closest it comes, if you want, because there's always an except. There is no such thing as a positive end of a magnet without a negative. You can't get chocolate without vanilla, and so there is no absolutely unconditional anything at the 3-dimensional level, or else it would not exist. So I was just going to say the closest that you could described as worth even talking about would be other than rather than simplistic, ritualistic pacifiers that you normally find in religion. And you can even find it in people that are not considered to be all that intellectual healthy in the city, but find it in things that seem to be compulsive behavior. That somebody says, well, the only way I get through life is I wash my hands once every 15 minutes. Or the only way I get through life, what makes me a better person, or at least keeps me going and inspires me I can do better, is attending Mass. I'm talking about every day. I have not missed Mass in 12 years. It is simplistic, ritualistic behavior becomes the closest. That's about all you can describe. I'll give you a second if you want to think about it. If there's a book, if you see a book out, a bestseller or any kind of book that says, how to be a happier person in 10 steps, 5 steps, 17 steps, 22 chapters, at a cut rate, what's it going to be? It will be information, directions, apparently thought, directed toward a more complete life, a more complete person, based upon what one should not be doing. The question is, or one way to query it, is to ask, is it even possible to distinctly state what a person should be doing to be doing better? Well, at first, anybody's intelligence almost would say, well, yeah. I mean, you just want to say yeah, whether you know what you're going to say next or not. Forgive me. Consider yourself forgiven. You would want to say, well, yeah, but now think about it. Is it possible? Now, I've talked enough here that you surely have heard it if you're listening, to hear what I'm generally pointing out. And rather than take all of what I've seemed to say that would be the prevailing processes, arrangements of life, and we try to open it up to just complete freedom of thought, speculation, and blah, blah, blah. Now I ask you, just try and let your imagination run free. And perhaps even put your hands out. And ask the question I just asked. Is it possible, just given the privacy of your own brain, is it possible to distinctly say what a person should do to be doing better? Now, everything wants to say, well, yeah, sure. But what? Now, even you, know that you can take a thou shalt not and make it into a thou shall. In other words, instead of trying to mention some Islamic or kosher rule of diet, rather than saying thou shalt not eat so-and-so, give yourself a break, folks. You can say, wait a minute, here's what we should do. To live a more complete life, thou should eat. And then all you do is list everything that's not on the forbidden list. Or take the 10 Commandments. To be a good Christian, instead of going thou shalt not, is because all you got to do is subtract the thou shalt not from the equation of I plus not I equals everything. Take all the all the shall nots, because all the shall nots and all the shalls equal all possibilities. So if you got a list here, all the things you shouldn't do. Like you should not insult your relatives. Let's say that was a great, thou shalt not steal. I fool around. And because you got the 10 Commandments ruling the majority of humanity in a religious sense, Christianity. I'm not sure that's true anymore, but at any rate, a whole lot of people claim to be Christians. Rather than saying and agreeing that, all right, the 10 Commandments, more or less, are a bunch of thou shalt nots. But wait a minute. Instead of simply saying thou shalt not steal, I can make it thou shalt totally respect others' ownership of private property. Now there's a positive thing to do in life, right? Boy, I got myself. You see it? Sophicism? No. Do you see? You can say that verbally, and it would, from one view, we can take this and run downfield with it. All right, here is a positive thing. Here is something that one should do, that one should devote real effort, time, thought, feeling, consideration. But one should behave also in such a way that you exemplify, you exercise, you live in such a way as to execute unconditional, absolute respect for the private ownership of property on the part of others. Now, that sounds like something to do. Right? By God, we all should be that way. It's just more civilized, and I'm just sure to be a better person. But why would you put it that way? Why would the idea be there to begin with? Because the original idea was, hey, man, don't take my stuff. It was like the original caveman neuron, the first two that could talk, as soon as they could talk. Just right past the primary level. That first caveman neuron turned around, he was hungry, and the other guy had something to eat, or he left a stone laying there that looked pretty, and he grabbed it. And the first thing he did, even before you had Abraham and Moses and Jesus and everybody else, you had this one neuron said, hey, man, don't take my shit. If that had not happened, you could not even conjure up, well, wait, a positive direction, a positive directive that would be good would be to let's all devote ourselves to exercising, understanding, and appreciating an absolute, unconditional respect on the part of others for their ownership of private property. You could do that, but do you understand this is all, in a sense, I'm not going to stay here if you don't see what I'm pointing at. It's all a kind of smokescreen. It's not normally done. But I was going through all this as a kind of ordinary intelligence response to me pushing it, if it was trying to listen to this, by saying, well, there are directions, or there could be directions that tell people what to do. But if you came up with them, if I said, all right, tell them to me. And I've already made you up one. And if anybody was out there was as smart as that, they could start making them up. All they got to do is take thou shalt nots and turn them inside out. But why would they even think of it? It's because the basic direction I'm suggesting to you institutionally is to tell people what not to do. The query I was going to give you on top of the query, not only to ask yourself, is it even possible to say what people should do to be doing better? If this is still seeming a little sketchy, let me give you the query on top of the query. Is it possible to say specifically what the future will be? Because they're the same question. Should I have done the punchline first and saved 25 minutes? If you could say what the future would be, do you see, then there could be, from a three-dimensional view, then you could tell people what to do to be doing better. But after all this time, do you see some on your own without me apparently preaching a lesson of some kind, that is not the norm? For somebody to do better, all the way from what would appear to be your individual thoughts and your individual guidance system, if you had such, to what would appear to be the great direction from these admirable, worthwhile external institutions such as religions. They're all based on, yes, we know what to do better. You come to us, we'll certainly tell you, or you go to yourself. And your brain says, well, yes, I'll tell you what to do. And what it tells you is things not to do, which many times strike people as, yeah, you're right. You know whether they do it or not, but, oh, yeah, you got me. But then where is what would resemble vis-a-vis that, as opposed to that, where is that which resemble a positive? Like, all right, you want to do better? I mean, you want to be a more complete person. Because you understand, you got an institutional serious flaw. I'll go ahead and say it to start with, because an institution is not going to say, well, here's something positive to do, because the institution cannot say it. But what they are saying, if they tried to, is to tell you what tomorrow will be. And they do not know. Because the only way that you could tell somebody in a positive way, if we're going to separate it right quick, just you can do this intellectually. If you're going to separate and say there could be a positive direction that's not simply a negative one, turned inside out. In other words, instead of thou shalt not steal, trying to say thou shalt unconditionally honor and respect private ownership. Now that last one, that wouldn't exist. All it is thou shalt not steal, and I see I can feel it. All right, if we could come up with one that had no negative counterpart, that was not an outgrowth, was not the mold growing all over poor Dr. Fleming. Of course, I understand the man did take pre-med and thought about dentistry, so you can feel as sorry for him as you care to. But were it not for that, if we tried to figure out something that had no negative initial source, what would you be describing if you could do it? You would be describing tomorrow. You would be describing some of the unknown workings of the sixth-dimensional world driving the aftershocks that appears to be our reality. So the query, on top of the query, can anybody actually predict the future? And unless you are really intelligent and sophisticated, you know that the answer is no. Or unless you slipped up and you are now majoring in meteorology and you can't back out. It is simply the fact that no one can predict the future. But do you hear that is the same thing, would be the same, or is the same thing, if someone could, with no negative source, with no negative root, in a non-polarized way, if somebody could give you a direction of here is how to be a better person. But see, it couldn't be institutionalized because the better person, city version, is always on the basis of, if the Catholic Church is going to tell you how to be a better person, I hope this don't come as a shock to you, what they're going to be describing is what it would be to be a Catholic. I mean, you knew that, right? Or if it's Harvard, it's going to tell you, yes, we know how to be a more sophisticated, complete person. What are they going to describe? They're going to describe the kind of thing that they try to put on their perspectives, their solicitation to the alumni. They're going to tell you, this is a Harvard man. So real information about how to be a better person could not be institutionalized. It could not be weighted. It could not be prejudiced. And that's not possible. Who in the city is going to say, if you say, I'm going to be a better person, who's going to tell me how? Anybody that tells you how is going to tell you how on what basis? Well, from my view, of course. Well, I'm not sure. What is it you do for a living? And you find the guy is a dentist or something. And you think, well, no, I don't think so. But then you can move up the institutional hierarchy in the city, and you can go from this one guy on the corner out there in the park that you say, I want to be a better person, who can help me? And several people say, well, I can help you, I can tell you. And you find out, from this guy, Guido, that his idea of being a better person is to end up being a what? Guido Jr. So you can think, nah, I'm too sharp for that. So then you end up going to the Catholic Church, let's say, or anywhere. And then what do you have? I mean, you're too sharp. I'm not going to listen to one guy's advice. I mean, he had on a turban and he was, making weird signs and said he was some kind of soothsayer. But no, I'm too sharp to fall for some old dumb cult. I'll go where they got real information. I'm not going to some small cult. I'll go to a big cult. I'll go to the church. An institution, because part of the job of an institution, at a very crude level, but it works, is to give the impression that they have no prejudice. Because you go to the Catholic Church, and what if you got to the head guy, or any religion, but you got to the Pope, and you say, how can I be a better person? Can you tell me? After he got through chuckling, he'd say, well, certainly, certainly. Who do I look like? Not like somebody rebuilds transmission. I'm the Pope. So it would show that you were too smart to go to some guy out there in the park wearing an army blanket with a towel calling it a turban, going to tell you how to live a better life. Now you go to an institution and you say, wait a minute. And the Pope says, now I'm ready to tell you if you're serious. And you say, oh, I'm serious. And you might say, well, no, wait a minute. No offense, your Popeness. But now I've already been through, like, there's a guy right down there in the park, right outside the plaza down here. Was over there wrapped up in a blanket, a guy named Guido. And the Pope might go, yeah, I know that. He goes, I asked him how I could be a better person if he knew, and he said, yeah. But then as soon as he started talking, I realized all he was doing, he started giving me little opinions like, well, you'd be a better person if you'd, marry my sister and get her out of the house. And the Pope goes, yeah, I see. And so you and the Pope would agree, let's say. And I'm saying the Pope, an institution. But apparently you're talking to one person, see. And you can say, well, now you understand, I can't go for that kind of thing. Well, that's a good thing. It's, you came to somebody big. You came to an institution. But still, if you'd listened to the guy down there in the army blanket and you'd followed him and you tried to live a good life, it'd be on the basis of living a what? A good Guido life. But no, you ain't no dummy. So you end up at the church. And you're doing what? The same thing. It's a different name. It appears to be a different level, and that is part of the use of institutions that life makes. It is a great metaphorical trompe-l'oeil. Because you look at the church, and it's this painting, and you think, well, the church is something else. The church is, well, I'm not sure why, but I know this, the church is not the same thing as that one guy down there in the damn park wrapped up in a blanket with a turban, a homemade turban, saying, yes, live by the great Guido teachings. But wait a minute, this is something else now. I should have never left my church. Back to Mother Church. Back to anything. Back to an institution. But there is no difference. Well, not to someone who won't say difference. There is, of course, all the difference in the world to the mainstream of life is why it is quite condemnable, contemptuous, blasphemous under certain conditions to follow a cult or one guy down there. He's hollering, stuff the church. I tried all that. I know what's going on. It's the Guido way. Forget the Catholic way, the Jewish way, or the Armenian way. It's the Guido way. For somebody who wants to recognize the difference, there is no difference between the two. Because both of them are outputs of the institutionalized input that life puts in man's nervous system to assist him in not thinking. Back to what I said was a side trip to start with, I ask you again, consider where all information comes from. Nobody ever likes to think about that because if you try to think about it at street level, all you do is get a headache anyway. But think about all the information that you've got personally, which would take you just a few seconds to track down how that came about. But then think about, wait a minute, how about on a more institutionalized level, like the lessons of history, the great general information that's kind of like mist, fog, clouds, atmosphere that surrounds a planet. Where did it come from? Now I repeat, there seems to be, you start naming the Muhammads, the religious, these ones pointing out, the Jesuses, the Moses, the Abrahams, that seem to have been one guy stood up here and there. Of course, notice all of them, they always point to another institution. But at any rate, even the individuals won't survive unless an institution grows up, unless they get moldy. I don't mean that in just a cheap shot. Unless they expand. It can't be one spore. It has to grow. The Guidos throughout history, they do not expand. That's why they're never heard of. So the idea that, well, there are great people, like Buddha. You do know that, I assume by now, no offense to Buddha or anybody, it's not even important, but for every Buddha running around that part of the world in 500 BC, there were squads of would-be Buddhas. They're everywhere. They're everywhere now. The only ones that get remembered are those that the mold begins to grow upon a spore. They're those that become institutionalized. But there is no difference between Guido and Jesus, or the Guido philosophy and the Catholic philosophy. Well, if you're real sharp, of course there is some difference. Life is using the Catholic. Life, as far as Guido, it's like something stuck in its ear. It's just it's a passing fancy. But insofar as somebody down there in Rome trying to find a difference, trying to see how life is arranged, there is no difference between Guido and the Catholic Church. There is no difference between any apparent source of information if it's at an individual level in the city or if it is in a grand, glorious facade, an institutional setting in the city. There is no difference because neither one of them serve any purpose in assisting man to think contraire. What's the whole purpose in seeking this information? Now, of course, the nervous system won't say this, but what's the whole point? Now, it might weasel out. It's not that I can't think. It's just I'm not sure exactly what to think about this. I'm interested in infinity. I'm interested in what's the purpose in human life. And I can't find the answers. I've been reading National Lampoon and the Inquirer for years. I need directions. And you find a church or a cult. You find something out there that apparently has information. And I can say, well, don't you see? If I was still so dumb again to talk to such people. And I said, well, don't you see? That is, you're only seeking some other information so that you won't have to think. Assume there's some possibility that you could, quote, think. Not in a sarcastic sense, as you know, but in some other way. Rather than you trying to do it, if such is possible, all you're doing is trying to get somebody else to do it for you. You're lazy. You want the easy way out, any kind of. And they could say, no. Oh, no, I hear that verbally, but you're wrong, because I have tried to think. I've done all sorts of things of my own. I left the church when I was young. I could have been rash, but I left the church, and I've gone off my own. I have followed cults. I have followed philosophies. I've taken drugs. I've tried to meditate. And I just can't, I've reached a dead end. And so I am now reconsidering my departure from my religion, or I am now considering going to another religion. And they would say, do you hear me? The nervous system could say, no, it's not because I don't want to, it's I can't. Picky. It's the same thing. There is no difference. The institutions, the apparent external input of knowledge and thinking is still to assist men in not thinking. Because what if you were just given the nervous system urge to think and no information out there? I guess you could be crude enough to think, well, boy, that would have made us think. Maybe. There is also, as always, in a polarized three-dimensional world, there's also the other possibility, and that is that man would have never thought. And, of course, there's always the ultimate possibility, if there was not some knowledge in the closet when you got there, where'd you get it anyway? But we won't go into that, because everybody believes that God is a keyhole. A little more sideways with this. Can you see that all of man's literature, at least outside the specific technical scientific writings, which is not the point, but all of man's real capital L literature, all of the arts, all the religions are all poetic dreams and descriptions of freedoms that man will never experience. Anytime that there is a description made of some kind of infinite freedoms, which I hope you didn't think you missed it. I hope you didn't miss it. All literature, all the arts are a poetic form of describing freedoms that will not be experienced by man. That is what makes them art. That's what makes them literature. But then what you have is that all of these descriptions of infinite freedoms are themselves examples of the spatial limitations of man's sensory existence. They attempt to describe freedom of all sorts, freedom of thought, freedom of expression. And I'm not speaking in some way civilly. I'm talking about this great urge that varies from person to person, obviously, but this urge that in some way I do want to be a more complete person. I do want to be expanded in some way. I do want to be more creative and blah, blah, blah. I want to live a better, fuller life, whatever that is. They're trying to describe then. And I say they're trying to. They pick it up as you should. Now, see, institutionally, normally, that's where they would, if you look at all, you see it, well, you picked up your idea of freedom from your religion. And if you got anywhere past that and you did go to school outside a neighborhood technical institute, you may have read a little philosophy, and then you got the idea that, wait, we could be free, and freedom would be even freedom beyond old-time religions and constrictive rituals and beliefs. But you still picked up the idea of some kind of freedom beyond you, somewhere else. But the freedom that you picture, the freedom that life lets man think about and describe, which if you're not describing it, you're not thinking about it, you've never thought about it, the description is not the orchard picturing something way outside the apple outside the orchard, as far as the apple can picture. No matter what drugs, no matter what hypnosis, no matter what kind of Guido apple, say, look into my eyes, the furthest they can think of this freedom, somebody in a cell, they think of freedom, being finally out of the clutches of my captors. As far as they can think, they cannot see it. The intellect cannot deal with this. But their picturization of the furthest, most infinite, if it was qualitatively possible, freedom is his cell wall. There is no other way. That is the physical basis of energy operating in a polarized manner in a three-dimensional world. Any freedom that can be vocalized is itself a form of captivity. And it really gets subtle, which I don't guess anybody wants to go into. That if you say it, you're owned by it. If you can describe, if you vocalize a freedom that you think is possible, that you want, that you think should be proper for you, at the ordinary level, you have, at least for the time being, you have nailed that door shut. Because you're now captive of describing this freedom. You can't get past it. I guess a good thing that I don't go any further with that. But it's a fact. Not reasonably. All dreams of freedom are descriptions of confinement. Well, all dreams of vanilla are what? They're proof you're eating chocolate. Why else would you be dreaming of vanilla? I mean, if you're sitting there and you're eating chocolate, and in the 3D universe you only got two flavors. If you're eating chocolate and somebody whips in and says, you look like not only an ice cream aficionado, but an ice cream aficionado, what with pretensions of thinking? In between licks you go, yeah. You say, what is your idea of freedom? And you've got no choice. He continues to lick, ponder, and let his mind run wild. Perhaps through the neural influence of Ben and Jerry, and no matter what he describes is going to be what? Vanilla. And conversely, if you find somebody that's eating vanilla and you ask them, describe freedom. What is the dream of freedom, the ultimate? All they can describe is chocolate. And do you understand that when you got two flavors and you look down there, chocolate and vanilla is right there. So any idea, any describable, any dream of freedom is an unrecognized description of captivity. Because your dream of what freedom is simply a notation that's unrecognized, but it's a notation of where your prison is, where the walls are. Any description that the ordinary intellect can come up with of freedom, no matter how footloose and fancy free it seems to be, is simply an unrecognized description of where your shoe is nailed to the floor. That's the only way that you describe. That's the only way you go, and try to think. Try to dream of the freedom. Because as far as you can go, there is no psychological flaw. It is physical. It is electrical. As far as it can go is right where your prison wall is. Right where your foot is nailed. Right where the flavor you're eating stops. And right past that is freedom, you think. But you hadn't described the other side of the wall, you described this side of the wall. You're just saying, well, if I get past the wall here, I'd be outside the prison, I'd be free. Right. If If you get through eating chocolate, you can have vanilla. But then you get vanilla, and I'll pop back, or you do, and say, well, how could I be a better person? I need more freedom. Back to chocolate. Speaking of, back on the subject of freedom and certainty, if we can hit some of it, how about get real otherworldly? That is subtle. There is a specific, unnoted, living, operational manifestation of how polarized energy operates and drives and moves in the three-dimensional world. And at first blush, I hope you'll follow, that would appear to be almost an exception. Or it would be almost ordinary human intellect pushing at the frontiers of Bastard and Robbins. Striving, crying out, we want strawberry. Something beyond the polarized limitations. It goes along these lines of, and you can hear this almost any day or read it, and they've been doing variation on it for a long time, but some of it might sound new. It is at the ordinary level when the human intellect is without any question striving to be its most free, its most expansive, its most tolerant, its most insightful. And it goes on nowadays in psychology that is institutionalized, and now you can find individuals, but institutionalized would seem to offer more proof to most people. So I could relate that there are psychologists around, psychiatrists, and of course the minor social critic here and there, an individual person, who seem to be trying to push the frontiers of ordinary thought. And they come up with such things as this: that the day has obviously arrived that we've got to get past the provincial limitations of conflicting religions and the chauvinistic barriers of conflicting psychological schools of thought and blah, blah, blah. That people are not, in the main, sick and ill and deranged, but that people are what they are. They should be free to be what they are. They should be encouraged to be what they are. That we now more and more see, perhaps, that life is not a matter of going back to some Eden or a new version of Eden as a paradise after life. It's now we live in a garden with a potpourri of differences. That some men are like tulips. Other men are like corn stalks. Some men are like birds. Some men are like worms. That we have this complete garden, and within the reasonable limits I'll get into, that people should not be forced into some sort of straitjacket, that it's not wrong for a corn stalk to be a corn stalk. That's what he is. And it's not wrong for this woman to be a petunia. She is a petunia. She shouldn't be forced, or she should not be made to think that she should be a corn stalk. People should be free. And this is the 20th century, by God. We can no longer be strangled by these borders, not only of religion and nationalism, but of psychiatry. And psychologists saying, well, wait a minute, there's a paradigm of what everybody should be like, which comes from the schools of psychiatry. We graduate thinking, well, humans should be like this, and anybody's a patient who does not fit into my picture of the norm. And of course, institutional wisdom being what it is, as soon as they go, well, I don't necessarily agree with that, then the psychiatrist goes, you resist. Is that proof or not? Yeah, but I'm a tulip. Yes, but it says right here, I've been told you should not be a tulip. So the nowadays, you can find this, and it sounds encouraging at first. Which why not? But that people should be free in this melange of a garden. That we all have our basic individual roles to play. That men should be free to be what they are. They should be encouraged to be what they are. Well, except when one person's life, as they won't call it that, begins to harm or hinder, his fellow man. Now, you knew that had to come. But nobody notices that. If you were an ordinary intelligence now, and you were sitting in front of your TV or a lecture, or the information you got in your nervous system, you would be, if you were just ordinary now, ordinary, sophisticated, part of the middle of the bell curve of life's growth through man, and you heard a psychiatrist. They said, here is one of the world's great thinkers or one of the world's leading psychiatrists. The man just won a Nobel Prize in urology, whatever. And he said, well, the day's come. I want to say this. I know some people may disagree, but the day has come. We have got to start treating people with respect on the basis that we are not all put together in the same mold. We're obviously not the same color, we're not the same sex, we're not the same religion, we're not the same nations. But everyone has a right to be free and to pursue their own goals. Well, except, of course, that your expression of your freedom cannot harm somebody next to you. Because the guy couldn't have left that out. And you don't even notice that. It's like, well, that's like putting a period at the end of a sentence. Or that's like wiping your mouth after you finish the ice cream. You knew that was coming. If you got an except, you got nothing. And yet the alternative right quick, at the ordinary level, is totally unacceptable. Oh, wait a minute. You got to have that last part. Because not only contemporary psychologists and psychiatrists, but even political thinkers in the past have tried to use it on the basis of civil freedom. That my freedom to behave in the way I want to should be more or less infinite, except my freedom stops, like the freedom for my hands to move about, me to do what I want to, or make dirty gestures, or to, pray. The freedom extends up until my hand, reaches your nose. That everybody should be free to do what they want to until your expression of freedom harm your fellow man, interferes with his expression of freedom, and vice versa. What's the alternative? Nobody would even say it. Or if they did, they would have no audience because they would be not part of life's mainstream, sane growth spores. You could not say everybody should be free. That we're all different, and we might as well face it. We've had 5,000 or 6,000 years now of spotty recorded history, and we're not the same. We're not getting any closer to the same. And some of these ideas of treating people because they act a little weird, this is all insanity. That was in the past. People should be free to be what they want to. More variety, more spice. The world's it's getting too small. We don't need all these little chintzy borders. And so everybody should be free to do what they want to. Thank you. No. That is no passing of usable energy. A person who would have an audience would not say that. You understand disgusting justice by now. The Nobel Prize winner, the psychiatrist, would not get up and say, everybody should be free to do whatever they want to, and thank you, and pack up his notes and leave. Such a man's not going to end up making a speech like that. If he did, nobody'd hear it. Or if he did, and everybody heard it, they'd lynch him. Because you simply must hear at the stable line of continuity along which directions life is now moving. You can't just say, well, everybody can do what they want to. Everybody should be free to do what they want to. We should encourage them. Not tell people, don't do this, don't do that. Tell people, by God, what you want to do does not necessarily coincide with what your neighbor wants to do. But you should be free to do it. Don't worry about it. Express yourself. Thank you and good night. No. It goes without saying. You don't even hear it. You would hear this first part maybe nowadays if I said that you were ordinary, and you might think, boy, that's good to hear that more and more people feel that way. And you don't even listen to the last part, because they always say everybody should be free to do what they want to. Everybody, I don't care what kind of weird people they are. Well, of course, except if whatever they do is too weird and it begins to interfere with you and me and everybody else, it's going to do you some harm, people can't be free to go out and hurt each other, steal each other's property. And they do it on the basis, which is corrective, like, well, I don't even have to say this. And of course they do. And they say, well, I shouldn't have to say this. And you go, yeah, I know what you're going to say. Because you do. From a more complex view, having an accept takes everything out of it. You have taken away any possibility of certainty. There is no longer any direction of saying, well, everybody should be free to what they want to do. That almost sounds as though it would be a response to my query about, is it possible to even instruct people in some positive way? That would almost sound like it. Well, yeah, the positive way is, whatever you want to do, be free to do it, you and everybody else. Except, you got to have an accept in there. And that takes away the certainty. That takes away what would apparently, from one view, otherwise be a positive, here's what to do. But notice this whole idea that must come out, that is part of the general flow of human intelligence now, the energy, that there's got to be the accept, that you should be free to do what you want to. More and more this is a prevailing, or more and more this is a used attitude that life has in life with man now. But it has to be free to do what you want to, but of course, up to the point that it does not harm anybody else. I think back, the kind of pictures, well, we got this great garden. Some people are petunias, some are flowers, or tulips, some are potatoes, some are corn. They all serve a purpose. And then some, if you want to go from into the animal kingdom, some are birds, some are squirrels. But notice, and some are worms, and they're all necessary. I don't have to go through this. You got to have birds to pollinate the flowers. You got to have worms to aerate the soil to keep the flowers. So the garden is self-sustaining. It's all a big closet. But notice this. In the garden, the reality of it, this idea, well, wait a minute. You should be free to do whatever you want to, up to the point that it harms somebody. When the bird in the garden eats the worm, there is no accept. Life does not stop the bird and say, wait a minute, you're free to be a bird, you're free to be a bird, but now you're infringing on the worm's right. That is the primary level, but don't excuse it, because the primary level is that upon which we all feed and we all stand. But notice when it gets to the secondary level, there can be no such attitude with ordinary people. It's not because they're wrong. It simply cannot be. Because there cannot be any sort of direction about here's what you should do. Because the ultimate in what you should do would be the ultimate direction of saying, listen, we should all be free to be what we are. You can't help what you are. But if what you are is that you want to molest children sexually, no. If what you want to do is steal, that's not doing your own thing. That's not what we're talking about, because you can't. Now you're talking about freedom, but your freedom is now harming somebody else, and you can't do that. So everybody should be free, except when what you're doing to be free and to express yourself is harming somebody else. If there isn't accept, there is no freedom. Well, yes, you're free to leave this cell, other than the fact that we're going to have to lock the door, but or any other description you want. Well, you're free to do whatever you want to. If you want to leave, leave. Except they locked the door and they left. We're out of tape.